President Zelensky has said that, quote, there is good news on the battlefield. And though he gave no specific details, his confidence was unmistakable. Russia is losing ground. What we're seeing right now is not just a setback for Russia. What we are seeing right now is the total upset of everything Russia had planned. Because today, we see that Ukraine, the country that was invaded, the aggrieved party, is in fact taking justice to the Russians. It is not only expelling the Russians from occupied territories, but is taking the war to Russia. Within Russia, we see the attacks on a daily basis by Ukrainians who are carrying them out with precision, avoiding civilian targets, and going for the very fundamentals of the Russian economy. Meanwhile, Russia, the country that thought it would have a 3-day special military operation, is not only being expelled from Ukraine, but its own ability to sustain itself, to keep the show on the road, is now diminishing because the Russian economy is running out of fuel. And as Russia begins to sputter, it becomes ever more clear that the last days of the Putin regime could be ever closer than we would imagine. My name is Jason Smart, and I'm a special correspondent for the Kiev Post and a national security advisor who specifically studies Russia and the Putin regime. And what we're seeing is pretty amazing. We are seeing that Russia is in a dire situation. And usually the press does not talk about it. But apparently, at this point, it's become so bad that even they are forced to mention the truth of what's really happening inside of Russia. And now keep in mind, when we talk about the Russian economy, it's not just those who support Ukraine who realize it's bad. It includes Russians who think it's bad. For instance, I'll read you a quote. The Russian economy is, quote, on the verge of going into a recession. That was not said by President Zelensky. That was said by Russian Minister of Economics, Rezhnikov. Or how about this? The growth of the Russian economy depends on free resources, and now we've truly exhausted all of those resources. That was the head of the Central Bank of Russia, Nabiulina. So in both cases, we hear them saying the same thing. Things are not looking very good for the Russian economy. And though Russia likes to claim that all is well, that their economy is doing great, that it's continuing to grow, it's simply not the case. Russia is not just growing. Russia today is barely able to stay afloat. But there's something else that's very interesting here. Ukraine's attacks, when you think about them, are actually costing Russia twice. Today, of course, there'll be an attack and it destroys an oil refinery. But tomorrow that means that Russia will have to spend more dollars. And there's a very limited number of dollars. Nobody needs rubles. So today, Ukraine is spending in ingenuity, whereas Moscow is paying in dollars. But there's something else going on. There's something else going on that is very important. It is that apparently everybody realizes that Russia is losing. After the meeting between President Zelensky and President Trump on Tuesday, President Trump said that, quote, Ukraine, with the help from Europe and from NATO, can win back all the land it lost. The reason he gave was excellent. It is because, quote, Russia is a paper tiger. Now, for months, President Zelensky has said that. He has said that Russia must feel that it's going to lose. That once Russia feels that it can't win, that it might actually lose more than it bargained, it is only at that point that Russia will take the negotiations seriously. But today, even those who had earlier doubted seem to be coming around. That it is very clear that Russia has no ability to win. Russia likes to talk about warfare, that likes to put on a show, but push come to shove, they don't know how to fight, and they don't have the capacity to fight. Now, Ukraine, of course, is very impressive. It's done a lot of things recently. And every day there's new footage that comes out. We saw the 4 Ukrainian FP2 drones. They struck Russia's Rubicon UAV unit near Sledove. Now, what's interesting about this was that each one of those drones is carrying about 100 kilograms or 220 pounds of warhead. Destroying Russian positions with this is, of course, impressive. But there's something else. It's so different from what the Russians have. Today, the Russians apparently are having a shortage of drones. The Ukrainians are not. The Ukrainians could always use more drones, that is for sure. And that is why we're fundraising for drones, which I ask you to please see the first comment below, which I've pinned. We have raised over 150,000 euros by bank transfer and PayPal for Ukrainian soldiers to get life-saving drones. And if you'd like to help, please do, and see below. But let's continue with this. Let's look at what is going on and why it is so interesting, because trust me, it's really interesting. We see something else though. The drones are destroying the material, these different buildings, the things that Russia needs to wage war, whether it's a factory that produces military goods or the factory where they refine oil. In all cases, it is necessary for Russia to continue fighting. But today, the attacks that Ukraine carries out are showing up on the balance sheets. We see that all these different attacks are making it difficult for Russia to get hard currency, something it gets when it sells things like refined gasoline internationally. But currently, it cannot. There's simply a shortage of fuel across Russia due to Ukraine's attacks. Ukraine is using cheap drones to destroy things that will cost the Russians millions to replace. We saw some more of the FP2s hit radar stations. We've seen them strike vehicles. Consider this. In 2023, about half of Russia's budget came from oil and gas. By 2026, that share is expected to fall to only about 20 to 22%. This year, the Kremlin is forecasted $109 billion in energy revenues, but the actual collection will be closer to $83 billion. That means there's a $26 billion shortfall, a 25% less than what they had anticipated. That missing money means there will be less defense spending. To give you an idea of how much money this is similar to the annual defense budget of a mid-sized European NATO country. For instance, Poland. Russia is missing what the defense budget of Poland is. That is a lot of money to be missing. But less money is a good thing, because when Russia is economically starved, that is when it will begin to negotiate. The Kremlin now has to choose, though, where it gets more money from. From whom will it deprive of a future? And it's taking money or debt it's giving to the National Wealth Fund. But what's the joke about that is that we don't really know how much money is left in the National Wealth Fund. There are different figures, and I've cited them before, but increasingly it looks like it is even less than we had thought. Currently, it's about $36 billion. That's down more than half since 2022. But a lot of people now are estimating that could be actually a quarter of even that. They may have already spent through it. Now, the Kremlin, of course, does not make most of its data available. And the data that it does make available, there's a reasonable chance that they're lying. The numbers simply do not add up. But there's also accounting tricks. As you know, accounting is an amazing field. There are all sorts of ways you can choose to process numbers or to program things to hide what they really are. And that's likely happening with the Russian economy. We know that the banking sector is often being tapped for cash, and it's giving that money away as loans, but the fact is the money will never come back. The defense sector will never repay it. So that's not a good thing for the banks, but it makes it very difficult for the bankers to be able to calculate a future if they have to use fictitious numbers, if they're trying to balance the books using monopoly money. But the average Russian himself is also feeling this. Prior to the war, and actually through 2023, household consumption was growing. In fact, more than 7% in 2023. But in 2024, it fell by more than 5%, and now it's only less than 3% in the first half of 2025. By comparison, global household spending, it's increased by about 5% per year. But Russia's on pace for half of that. So what's happening? What's happening inside of Russia? Why are Russian families choosing to cut back? Why are the state collections, the revenues, also continuing to decline? Well, one of the reasons is that inflation is compounding the situation. Everything is getting worse because everything is more expensive and the value of the money is less and less. So the current inflation rate within Russia, we don't know exactly what it is, but we can say this. We can look at things like the unemployment rate. It's currently about 2.2%. That might strike you as very low. And it is very low. In fact, it is too low. It should be more than double that. But this very low inflation rate, it correlates with something else. Very high inflation. So it's probably not surprising that almost half of Russian workers are looking for a second job. They cannot live on their salaries. So you have very, very low unemployment, but nobody's making enough money to survive. That sounds a lot like inflation. The situation within Russia, though, is worsening as savings have lost their values. Wages cannot keep up. And there's also the energy strain, this daily pressure that is on everybody. Meanwhile, we see that continually throughout the country that the fuel costs continue to rise. Every time that Ukraine strikes a refinery or port, that means that things will get more expensive. Because it's not just the oil that gets more expensive. It's not just gasoline. It's everything that uses them. Every truck that delivers any product, any transport of any person becomes more expensive. For everything in Russia, life is getting more expensive and people cannot afford to keep up. Russians today are in a situation that is quite reminiscent of perhaps the 1980s in Russia. There is stagflation, things are getting worse and not getting better, and there's no plan to turn it around. Nobody knows what can be done. And today the Kremlin doesn't have a plan. There is no strategy to turn it around. The fact is, they can't have a strategy. Because rule number one, the first thing they should do is undoubtedly end the war. Consider this. The attacks carried out by Ukraine, day and night, are having a significant impact. Even with oil today moving, Russia's September oil and gas revenues are projected to be down 23% compared to last year. But the money they're getting today, it's not like it used to be. It's not just money that helps stabilize the economy. A sizable amount of that money is now going for things like the repair of different oil refineries. It's going for things like insurance against drone attacks. Now, for months, many people had thought that the Russians would just advance. Russia is a very large country. It's got a much larger population, about 139 million people, versus roughly 25 million in free Ukraine. So it would be reasonable to assume that a war of attrition would favor Russia. But that is where Ukraine has been so smart. Ukraine has refused to fight a war of attrition, a war that would cost Ukrainian lives and likely not be winnable. But today, Ukraine has chosen to take the war to Russia and make it impossible for Russia to continue fighting. Now, the pensioners will have to make a decision. Do they want food or do they want the heating? We'll see that the regional budgets will have to cancel their projects for this winter because there's going to be no way to pay the payroll. Obviously, they're going to stop road construction, and we're going to see that the clinics will be cutting their services, and the factories are going to be relying ever more on imported parts. But those parts are hard to get because if it's imported, it means it needs foreign currency. So today we see more and more workers getting unpaid leave. We see that local demand is falling ever farther. And this is all the while the households of Russia continue to suffer. And yet Vladimir Putin continues with his delusion of needing another war. But today we see that the war machine is running out of money and out of men. Moscow is short on both. Ukraine, however, has a lot of capacity to continue fighting. It is Ukraine today that has not only the soldiers needed and increasing numbers today joining the military, it has the support from other countries that allow it to keep fighting to make sure they can pin down Russia. So today we see that Ukraine, of course, in a challenging situation, is not the one that should be worried today. Ukraine should take precautions and must fight diligently. However, it is Russia that is in a position that it really has no good outcome. It has no ability to balance this out. So as we watch, we see that Vladimir Putin every day is getting deeper and deeper into the quicksands. And the good news about that is that he will not be escaping. So let's look ahead. What comes next? But I assure you, whatever it is, it's ever more positive than what you had thought. Thank you for watching. Please like this video. Please subscribe to this channel. And consider becoming a channel member today. And leave your comments below. I love to read them. I love to hear what you think about the current situation. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.